What does it mean to you and the team for the president to potentially be losing control? How do you use that word?
So I think this all flows directly from this question of what the actual objectives are for the war and how the president sees success. You know, when we look out right now at the war and the current situation, it's unclear how the United States and the president can declare victory without laying out for the American people what it is he sought to achieve. We've seen varying forms of him laying that out, whether it be from detailing blowing up and destroying the ballistic missile force and the Navy, which, you know, we've seen a lot of effort to do, and it sounds like has been rather successful, but then also looking for the Iranian regime to capitulate and or fall directly. And with that question looming over all of this, we have now a shifting narrative. If we think back just a couple days or a week, Iran seemed to be fully on their back foot, lashing out, but having suffered a massive hit from the U.S. and Israel. But here, after further increases in oil prices and clarity that the United States cannot quickly reopen the strait, it seems to be shifting significantly. And the statements from Iran's leader today seem to imply that they certainly seem to see it that way. And so that raises questions as to how the president can move forward here and whether he still feels it's possible to declare victory in the short term, or he has to escalate with the hope of forcing the Iranians to de-escalate, which has not been successful so far.
Two very different options. I mean, does one say to you that if he continues to move forward, which it seems to be the case at this point, although we're talking about boots on the ground and whether or not that will happen ultimately, but does that to you then say, or you and the team, that potentially the president is losing control of this war if he continues to move forward?
So I think the problem we're seeing here is, again, not about the president, as we just heard before, losing control of the actions that are happening, but really the unanticipated, or in some cases very anticipated, consequences of the war continuing. The longer this goes, the greater the impact on the global economy and the greater the impact on U.S. forces, right? On that front, we had a U.S. aircraft that was apparently hit by Iranian fire, make an emergency landing yesterday. Things like that are going to increase and keep happening. Accidents will happen, and the Iranians will get lucky. And that raises the political and the cost of lives in this conflict. And on the economic side, we're seeing it day to day. The rise in oil prices are putting pressure on everything around the globe, with inflation being the key word right now. That's starting heavily to impact economies in East Asia and Asia writ large that are most reliant on the Strait of Hormuz, but that will spread to the United States as well, impacting what is already seen as an affordability crisis. So I think those are the factors that stand to kind of increase without movement towards de-escalation in the short term.
You know, Adam, I'm glad you brought up other countries here, because as Carol often reminds us, what happens there is not a vacuum, and we have to look at Iran. We have to not just look at Iran in the Middle East, but we have to look at China, we have to look at Russia, we have to look at Ukraine. And we got a headline earlier today about how the Kremlin would potentially stop sharing intel with Iran if the U.S. cut off aid to Ukraine. What are you watching in that region and sort of the dynamics that Putin is playing with regard to Iran?
Yeah, the offer from the Kremlin certainly seemed too cute by half, right? This effort to try and equate the two wars together and highlight that its support of Iran is no different than the U.S. support of Ukraine. And there's no doubt that Moscow is likely relishing in that moment. And as you said, though, there are clear consequences of this war already, and what happens if it continues on other conflicts or potential conflicts. In Ukraine, the biggest clear problem is this question of U.S. hardware, and particularly interceptor missiles, and how many may be available to provide to Ukraine so they can continue to defend their cities and their territory writ large from the onslaught of Russian ballistic missiles and drones. And when we look to the Indo-Pacific, every day the United States is using exquisite weaponry that would be needed in a conflict if something were to occur in the South China Sea or over Taiwan with China. And there's no doubt that Beijing has taken note of that. And, as you've heard from countless experts, the timeline to produce and rearm for the United States is not a question of weeks or months, but likely years. Wow. And that will change how the United States can conduct its operations anywhere in the world, but particularly in the Indo-Pacific.
And that Putin headline offers to help to stop sharing intel with Iran, that came from Politico. And Politico also reported that the U.S., Carol, rejected the Putin offer for Iran-Ukraine quid pro quo.
Yeah, there's just, it's like this giant chessboard, and I just think about
a game of Risk.
But I feel like I need more than just two people playing, because it just feels like there's so many pieces. And this is what you guys do, Adam. You think about the geoeconomic implications of all of this. You guys, we keep thinking about what all of this is doing to the global economy, and it does feel like we're going to be a different world going forward. I can't tell whether that's a better world and more collaborative, or are we going to be more divided after this? How are you guys continuing to report that out and think about it?
So we're certainly trying to keep our eyes outside of the region and for example, focusing on the things that are happening that are still very consequential for the global economy and for the United States, like Prime Minister Takaichi of Japan's visit yesterday to the White House. That visit was originally all about China. It was all about framing Japan's interests and keeping, as Japan has hoped, the United States in line as it negotiates with Beijing in what was supposed to be a meeting just a couple days from now, but has now been delayed between President Trump and President Xi. But even there, we saw the direct impacts of the war. We saw pressure on her and Japan to live up to the president's expectations, but also this move now for Japan to buy more oil from the United States and decrease its reliance on the Middle East, given this type of conflict. And I think we're going to see lots of changes spiraling out from the war, some anticipated and some not.